Chapter 5. The Units of Story. My younger son, Max, has always loved the building bricks from Lego. The problem is, they're a real pain in the ass to clean up, and when he was 4 or 5, he would get really overwhelmed when it was time to clean up all the bricks strewn across the floor. To help him, we took the enormous problem of cleaning up his floor full of bricks and created a handful of small piles that he could clean up one at a time. It made a job that seemed insurmountable, manageable by breaking it down into smaller pieces. Up to now, we've been looking at our entire global story so we can figure out the values at stake, what the big conventions and moments in our story need to be, and how to shift them in the correct way. But at the end of the day, we're still staring down a 50,000, 100,000, or 200,000 word story we have to write. That's too big for me to wrap my head around, especially as a beginning writer. Instead, let's break this big problem into smaller problems that are easier to digest. How do we do this? What are the smaller parts of the large story we can break it into? The highest level in this whole start-to-finish story, that's our entire manuscript. The next level down is our quadrants, the beginning hook, middle build 1, middle build 2, and ending payoff. That breaks our story down into 4 pieces that are roughly the same size. This is where we can start applying some useful story math. The beginning hook should be about 25% of our total word count. The ending payoff is another 25%. Then the middle build is 50%. Then we split the middle build into 2 equal parts, middle build 1 and middle build 2, that are each 25%. So if we're thinking through a novel that will be 50,000 words, each quadrant of the story gets about 12,500 words. How is this helpful? First, as we're writing the novel, we can keep these numbers in mind. As we're approaching that 25% mark on our expected word count, we know we should be wrapping up the beginning of our story. Our protagonist should be entering the extraordinary world, and we should be starting middle build 1. I recently finished the first draft of my next novel, and these markers were a huge help. They became points of reference on a really long journey. Writing without them would be like planning a road trip from New York City on the east coast of the United States to Los Angeles on the west coast without maps or GPS. Instead of trying to drive the whole way in one shot and hope we make it there, we break the journey up into chunks. First, I have to get about a quarter of the way to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Then the halfway mark is about Omaha, Nebraska. Then, once I'm through Denver, Colorado, I know I'm almost there. Looking at our novel, the first 25%, or beginning hook, is where a problem arises related to basic human need and our protagonist, or luminary agent, reluctantly agrees to deal with it. Throughout the middle build 1, our luminary agent uses her best skills to solve the problem. But everything fails. And about 50% in, she falls into chaos. In middle build 2, the luminary figure tries to navigate the chaos and finds a novel way to approach the problem by the 75% mark. In the ending payoff, the last 25%, the luminary agent applies her new tools and skills to resolve the problem. Can you see how breaking the whole story into smaller units helps you plan and draft your story? It also helps on the editing side. When we evaluate our first draft, we can look at the 4 quadrants, and they should be roughly the same percentage of our story. If we look at our manuscript and we're approaching 35% of our word count and still setting up our story, that could very well be a problem. I'm going to be honest here. When Shawn introduced me to this idea, I didn't buy it. It seemed too simple and again formulaic. But then I started paying attention. When I first read 11/22/63 by Stephen King, I was still early in my journey with StoryGrid. When Jake Epping, the luminary agent of our story, transitioned into the extraordinary world, I stopped and checked how far I was through the book. It was 26%. When my wife and I watched The Family Man, and the luminary agent, also named Jack, reached his point of no return and transitioned from middle build 1 to middle build 2, I paused the movie and sure enough, we were halfway through. Obviously there are exceptions, but the vast majority of stories fit this form and, as a newbie writer, I've found if it works for the great storytellers, I'm going to stick with it for now. The next level down from the quadrant is the sequence. The sequence is a group of 3 to 5 scenes that move your story forward in a significant way. You can think of these mini missions on the way to achieving the luminary agent's global mission. The final level is the scene itself. Scenes usually average 1,500 words. Again, there is some variation here, and there should be. If every scene we write is 1,500 words, the book won't feel right. However, when we're thinking through our novel, this rule of thumb can give us a rough sketch of how our story is going to look. Let's assume we're writing a story, and we think it's going to be about 60,000 words. If we break that down into quadrants, that comes to 15,000 words per quadrant. If we divide that by 1,500 words, it gives us 10 scenes. If a sequence is 3 to 5 scenes long, then we are looking for about 3 sequences per quadrant. Shawn introduces a smaller story unit, beats, inside of the story grid, but I believe in almost every instance it's not helpful to get down to a beat-by-beat investigation of our story, so we'll stop at the scene level. Breaking our word count into quadrants, sequences, and then scenes gives us a useful starting point for our writing. We've taken our giant pile of Lego bricks and separated them into manageable piles. I can't stress enough here that these are not crazy strict rules your story must follow. They're like staking out a house with sticks and string. We're getting a rough idea of how it should look before we pour concrete. Once we are writing, it can be helpful to look at these different parts of our story to see if it is working, to see if there's a value shift. How do we know if there's a value shift? Now we can dive into the 5 commandments of story, our step-by-step guide to creating value shifts.